So this Experts at Work webinar is on the dynamics of executive teams. It's for members of all three of our networks. We're recording the sessions you've just heard. And a big welcome to Andrew Day from Metalogue, who are a strategic change consultancy specialising in org design, culture change and executive team development, and whose research, The Unspoken Life of Executive Teams, Andrew is taking us through today, which I think is a great title. So quick word on timings. Andrew's sharing some thoughts for the first third or so. Then we'll have a breakout session for about 15 minutes with a couple of questions Andrew's got up his sleeve, finishing with some more recommendations from Andrew and some reactions from everyone on the call with a hard finish at 12 o'clock. Do send us questions and suggestions on chat throughout. Also, of course, your experiences of working with executive teams, your current challenges, we'd love to hear all those as well. And please, if you put yourselves on mute for now, thanks very much. And we'll turn over to Andrew. I think you have some slides, don't you?
Great. Well, thank you, Richard. Great introduction. Lovely to be welcomed and to meet you all. So I'm going to talk a bit about some research that we did as a consultancy back towards the kind of tail end of the pandemic. So we kind of completed it in December 2021. So which feels like quite a long time ago now, but actually isn't that long, is it really? But so I think some of what you hear about the research, you've got to bear in mind that we were talking to people during that period, but I think it in itself was really helpful because the intensity of the experience people were experiencing kind of highlighted some really interesting challenges that executive teams face. So I'm going to share my slides. I managed to do that. And clear? Can everyone see that? So just say a little bit about the research and what we did just to position it. I won't say too much, but we were interested in this. There's an awful lot that's written about teams, really from a kind of quite a normative perspective, what makes a good team and how teams should function. And our interest was, a lot of our work is with executives, and we do a fair amount of executive team development. And we were interested in trying to get at this question of what's it like to be on an executive team and to be part of that team, and what do people find actually helps them work together as a team. So we were trying to see the kind of experience of a team through their eyes, if you like. We spoke to a number of CEOs, most of whom were our clients, and a few that were people we got in contact with through our networks, and executives about their experience of leading an executive team, what it was like, what were some of the challenges. We also, as I mentioned before, we were working with executive teams, a number of clients during this period. So we were kind of, as a consultancy, we were documenting our experience, making observations, thinking about what we thought was working, and listening to the team's experience of what they thought was working and what wasn't. Our observations of executive teams from our broader consultancy work, and in some inquiry and conversations with people who were in kind of what we might think of as change agent roles, kind of HRDs, heads of OD, people who might be working closely with their executive teams in organizations. And I should say there's 6 of us in Metalogue, so 6 partners and a number of associates. So that's broadly, we were the group that were kind of meeting regularly to think about, well, what sense are we making of what we're hearing? So the first big theme that stood out is this idea of a triple challenge. And I think the first 2 probably won't be any surprise to you, that executive teams face a challenge to oversee the performance of their organization, whatever business or sector that is in, and they'll have some metrics such as profit and loss, market share, that will give them some indication of how are we actually performing today. And so that's a nearer term horizon. But increasingly, I mean, I think that the language of transformation is used in almost every single client we're working with at the moment. So executive teams, also most of the teams we speak to, have this second challenge, which is a transformational challenge. how are we going to adapt the organization to the changes that are happening in our markets or our sectors, whether that's new technology, etc., etc. And I think you'll all be familiar with that. And then the final one, which I think is something that was an interesting one for us to observe, and I haven't really seen this spoken about or talked about anywhere else, is this idea of an existential challenge. It's this kind of question that organizations are facing into, of kind of, why do we exist, and what is our purpose, and what's our broader role in society? So, for example, an obvious one is, the climate emergency. What's the organization's response to it? We're working, with several civil service departments, and one of the executive teams we're working with has really wants to do something fundamental and systemic about things like net zero, but to find the time and the energy and the focus to do that is incredibly hard. If you kind of think, this period when we were talking to them was kind of during the pandemic, but also it's post-Brexit. It's in a kind of period of kind of some degree of political turmoil within the UK. So facing into and engaging with this existential challenge is really difficult, and it's easy for leadership teams to kind of turn away from it and not ask themselves the big questions. So I think this kind of whole question of what do we mean by effectiveness is not necessarily straightforward, and quite a lot of the literature would talk about, well, we'll develop a team to be more effective, but what does that actually mean in practice? And what we discovered is that executive teams need to be able to shift their attention between different time horizons, and to think holistically. And that really is influenced by anxiety. So I'm going to say quite a lot about anxiety, but what we know about human behavior is the more anxious you get, the more near term your thinking becomes, and the more narrow your focus is. But if you look at these challenges, almost what you need to do is be able to shift your attention between near term, medium term, longer term, whatever that is for the particular organization in question, and to think systemically. So what makes this difficult? Well, there are a number of contextual pressures that we discovered. Firstly, it's demanding, and it's getting more demanding, was one big headline that we heard. For instance, I mean, one of the teams, or several teams we spoke to, were executive teams with it for NHS trusts. And given the timing of when we spoke to people, they were talking just about how burnt out, how demanding the role was, that having to look after organizations that were, dealing with society's trauma because of the pandemic, but also having to deal with their staff's anxiety about working during the pandemic, COVID, trying to keep people safe, and dealing with kind of massive, fundamentally reconfigure how the hospital works and its services. So that's a theme that repeated itself to us throughout the different conversations and observations. The other theme that we heard is that almost every executive team, there is a crisis going on at some point in an organization, and the team needs to work out, well, how involved do we need to get within this crisis? Do we really need to work out what our response is? Or do we just need to make sure that we're organizing people to respond? Or should we keep right out of it because actually we're not going to add value to this? A sense of scrutiny, all eyes being on the executive team, and that creating a pressure in of itself. I mean, in the more political organizations, a sense of, well, what decision you make in this meeting today could be on the front pages of the paper tomorrow, and you don't really know exactly how the politicians might respond as well, or your employees. Or if you're in a large international organization, you're equally faced with similar levels of scrutiny. and the question of boundaries of who is in the executive team. This I think genuinely surprised us. This idea that exists, that a team has a boundary and we know who's on the team and who's not. Well, then once you start noticing this, it's hard not to. But almost every executive team I work with, there's a question of who is actually in the team or not. And where do you draw the boundary of who's going to be involved in the executive team development work? And what are people's roles within that process? I mean, particularly quite often the HRD, vice president of HR, is always kind of, well, what's my role here? Am I part of the team? Am I trying to kind of work with the consultants who are working with the team, or am I responsible for developing the team? How involved? When am I in? When am I out? And the other theme around boundaries is constantly changing membership. Almost every team we were working with, by the end of the work, there were new members of the team and people had left. So having to think about development as a kind of rolling process where people would be joining, and you're having to kind of help people get established within the team, but you're also having to pay attention to people leaving and departures. Now, every time, one could think that every time someone leaves a team, it's a new team, and that needs to be noticed and considered. And sometimes people would just leave and no comment is made about their departure, or very little. But that has some consequences, shall we say, for how the team functions. The sense of being pulled in multiple directions. So it's really hard for executive teams to, and probably harder than any other teams, because they have their own functional objectives, demands, but they have to come together to work as a whole. And that's a really challenging tension for working as a team. And unrealistic expectations. There's all sorts of projections onto executive teams of maternal and paternal projections of, you should be looking after us, you need to be doing this, you need to be extremely competent, you can't show vulnerability. These sorts of unrealistic expectations where executives are almost perceived to be not like you and I. Is this landing? How's this landing? Okay. So there's some of the pressures on the team. So what we could have thought was important about the emotional life of executive teams that we heard is one, there's a bit of a question we got to quite quickly, which is we have to have an answer to the question of why people would put themselves through this. I mean, why do executives and why do teams function together? There must be some force pulling them to want to coexist, to work together. And the strongest evidence we have that answers that question is a sense of pride and an achievement that comes with leading a large complex organization, or leading an organization with some sense of purpose and trying to have an impact. That if you get it right, and when it's right, and people pull together and they feel like they've achieved something, to some degree, that is what executives and what's really driving executives to kind of stay motivated, stay engaged, because most of them don't need to do it for the money because they've earned enough money. It's something else that's driving them. But the other things that we discovered is a kind of sense of ambivalence and doubt, particularly around making high-profile, significant decisions, and that the risk is that the teams themselves kind of fudge the issue or avoid hearing both sides of a decision, really exploring the pros and cons, for fear either that it will surface conflicts and different disagreements within the team, or it will open up difficult and intractable issues that can't really be solved or resolved, or they have to then face into the particular risks that might happen if they make a decision. So to bring that to life a bit, kind of one example is kind of doing a number of teams that we were working with during this period were grappling with the question of return to work. If I guess, well, quite a few organisations have worked out how they're going to do this. Some of clients we're working with are still in a position where they're kind of still quite a lot of ambivalence around how often are we going to come into the office, what are the kind of rules of the game. But they've all been changed, haven't they? Because we're all working at home. And then there was a period when we could go back to the office. And now we're in a period where some people want to be back in the office most of the time, and some people really don't want to be back in the office at all. But how is an organization going to function? Well, regardless of what our particular views are on those sorts of questions, executive teams, when we were talking to them, were grappling with that question. Some were having an open debate, discussion, thinking it through as a collective, and others, there was a kind of sense it was being kind of avoided, or decisions were being made but not being committed to. A real underlying sense of anxiety and insecurity that is sometimes under the surface and sometimes gets more clearly expressed. I think it's more helpful when it is expressed and made explicit. But the kind of anxieties might be around things like feeling out of control, fears of getting it wrong, being criticised, losing one's job. And linked to that is the risk always that the team itself gets into kind of denial or avoidance, either of its feelings, of its emotional life. So things can sound quite rational and logical, whereas actually it is a lot more emotional, but the emotions are not being discussed or being surfaced. Which is why we got into this kind of question of the unspoken emotional life of executive teams, is this idea that there is an emotional life, but it's not being spoken about, it's not being expressed. And things on the surface can appear quite rational and thoughtful, but really there's a lot more going on than meets the eye or being spoken about. So just to kind of start to bring to some conclusions, I mean, we kind of thought, well, first of all, it's helpful to debunk the myth of the ideal executive team. It's not helpful, really, in the sense that this idea of the kind of language of high-performing team, or that can feel quite persecutory, I think, to leadership teams. That there's a kind of sense, it invites a kind of sense of shame that one isn't doing all the things that one should be doing. Rather, the reality of executive teams is that it's an ongoing struggle to find the time, capacity and inclination to work together as a team, and it is probably more of a struggle than other teams would face in an organization. So we also observe that when the kind of demands and the pressures on the executive team exceed their capacity to think, the capacity to contain their emotions, their anxieties, then their attention narrows. They become more focused on immediate concerns, how the shareholder's going to react to this decision, or we're working with a government department that's being formed from the merger of two kind of legacy departments, and some of the conversation is moving into, well, how many offices should we have and who should be in which offices, which is a relevant concern, but I think there's some realization and recognition amongst them as a leadership team that they wouldn't be doing their job if that's what they're really worrying about and thinking about. But that is the kind of sense of, when you're too anxious about the near term, then you can't think about the important stuff. Less able to draw on their capabilities, the differences within the team, their experiences, less resourced, and losing their emotional boundaries. All the projections that are put onto executive teams if they internalize them and react too much to them, then one could argue that they've lost their sense of what's their view of the world, what's going on for them emotionally. They've taken on other people's emotions and fears and anxieties and have become less able to think for themselves and feel for themselves. And I think why this matters is they have less capacity, attention for these big existential strategic questions that ultimately they need to be thinking about for the longer term health of the organization. So I'm going to quickly run through what we think helps. I'll run through these quite quickly, and then we can get into kind of having some discussion in breakout groups. But what we thought helps, and this is partly based upon the work that we do, is, I think there's a kind of key meta kind of statement, which is help the team to develop by focusing on the work that it is there to do, rather than getting overly focused on relationships or doing things like, I don't think there's many executive teams that would do this, but kind of outward bounds types exercises where you're kind of doing an activity together, but that activity doesn't put the work and the challenges of the organization at the center of the development work. So what we think helps, creating regular punctuation points for the team to stand back and reflect. There's one executive team that we work with, and we basically have half a day with them every couple of months. And the purpose of that half a day is really to suspend the usual working agenda of an executive team's meeting. And we will run a very simple process that starts with a bit of a check-in of how are you, what's around, what really is concerning you, and what are some of the opportunities, or something like that, that just invites them just to stand back and reflect a little bit on what's the work that we're doing, where is our attention, and how are we working together. Investing in building relationships and supporting relationships. So tomorrow I'm working with a relatively new executive team, and they're meeting with us for the first time. And part of the start of the work is helping them understand and know each other a little bit more, and understanding who knows whom and who doesn't know whom, because there's established relationships that sit in the background. Getting clear on what's their role and what's their desired impact. This might sound a bit of a crazy thing to say, but quite often, in my experience, executive teams don't really know or haven't really thought about, well, why do we exist? What is the value-added role of this executive team over and above all of the other teams, different to the board, and what really is the impact that we want to have? Being mindful about where their attention is directed, asking difficult questions around purpose and impact, supporting risk-taking in speaking to the team's emotional life. What you might find, and what I always look out for when I'm working with a team, is for someone who takes a risk to say something that's not being spoken about, and then observing what happens next. Does it go plop and then someone else changes the subject? Or does someone else come in and say and support that person and say something like, I can see where you're coming from, I feel something the same, or I listen to you and I have quite a different reaction to that along the lines of this. So there's a kind of building on and a response to the risk that is taken. And if no one comes in to support someone who takes a bit of a risk, then I'll make sure I always stand with them and say something to affirm what they've said, and try to make sure it gets noticed and they don't end up feeling like the crazy person in the room that's is saying something that no one else can get. And working through ambivalences and doubts, kind of trying to notice when people are expressing different sides of a dilemma, or expressing different sides of a risk, of we should do this, oh, but this, but if we don't do this, then this, and helping people to kind of integrate that what they're expressing is the other side of a dilemma. Okay. So I thought it would be helpful at this stage to give you a chance to reflect a bit on your experiences. And so the invitation is to choose an executive team or a leadership team you experience or observe. And I say leadership team because you might not have enough direct observation of the executive team in your organization, but there'll certainly be leadership teams that you will know. And what are the dynamics that you're seeing, and how might these be linked to what is happening contextually? So the kind of research, what we've tried to convey, or I've tried to convey, is how the dynamics, the emotional life of the executive team is linked to what is happening around them, can be thought of systemically, and what, if anything, is or has helped the team to function effectively. So what do you think is helpful for them working together as a team? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm just before we go, we've got breakout rooms ready to go, and those are the
two.
So keep the slide up if you would. I just want to nip over to Pippa. I'm going to leave your point about risk for now for after the breakout rooms, but I did want to just go to, because Alan's, if you look in the chat, Andrew, there's an equally good question from Alan Meller, Alan on evidence. Did you find any evidence this is linked to executives being unable to relinquish control, and so they need to be involved in decision making that should be held elsewhere in the teams, meaning they're too involved in the detail and unable to focus on longer term strategic existential questions?
Oh, absolutely. I think that is one of the kind of common themes, really, is around control. I mean, I always think that control is the defense against anxiety, that people who whenever I feel I have to try to control something, it's because I'm anxious about it. But a lot of the focus tends to go, in my experience, on the doing or what is being tried to control, rather than it's very hard, really, but it's the more you can help a group or a team to talk about what they're anxious about, can help them then to recognize that that's behind their control. But yes, an ongoing challenge.
Yes, got you. Okay. Alan, did you want to respond to that before we go to breakout rooms?
Well, I'm pleased that you've observed that, because that's absolutely what I observed. So yeah, I think it's probably going to come up in the discussion a bit more as well. So.
I mean, I think it goes with the whole territory of, I mean, what we're trying to say is just the intense anxiety that executive teams face. And of course, kind of transformational challenges and more existential challenges that quite often isn't an answer, or that controlling them is just exacerbates the problem, rather than what needs to be done is the kind of letting go of control and enabling others to find solutions. But
I think it's that point around the perform. You had that slide at the beginning of the three challenges, and the performance one is the one that actually they should have the right capability and trust in those individuals to deliver on a lot of the stuff that contributes to performance. But because they have been successful and that's how they've got into these senior level positions, often they go back to what they're comfortable with.
Exactly. Exactly
that area, meaning the other areas that you rightly highlighted don't get the right level of attention.
And I think the other thing is out of those three challenges, the one that is known and is most tangible and can be more easily controlled is the performance one, or the operations that are part of that performance dimension.
We're bordering on answering the question before we've gone to the groups, so I'll stop.
Good. Okay. Well, does the question make sense? The questions make sense to people. Does that feel relevant?
Yeah, very much to run. I think we'll go for it. I'm going to open up the rooms. Apologies if there's the odds changing around. So it's, what dynamics are you seeing in your leadership teams or ones that you observe? How might these be linked to what's happening contextually, and what, if anything, has helped the team to function effectively? So we'll give it a good 15 minutes. We'll be back here in 15 minutes time. Oh, and Colette, network member Colette, if you could just hang on, and I just want to check that everything's working for you. Here you go, the breakout rooms. See you shortly. Thanks, Andrew.